No, it's a very tricky question. I think we do have a well-established tradition from Rav Hai Gaon and the Rambam and the Rav Ram ben Rambam, and then expanded upon by the Maharal, that there are many elements in our rabbinic literature, the Midrashim, that are not necessarily literal. Every statement in the Midrash is, of course, true, but the truth may be clothed in parable, in metaphor, and the like. So to say, for example, just to give you one example, that the Medrash that says when Vashti didn't want to go to Achashverosh is because she grew a tail. If one were to interpret that in a figurative, metaphorical way, that would not be heresy, meaning there is such an approach in classical commentators, and as I say, this goes back as far as Rav Hai Gaon, the year 1000, way before even Rashi. But once we come to the Torah, I think we do have a fundamental problem. I see, for example, that in some of the non-Orthodox movements, they deny the historicity of the Exodus of Egypt, and they say it's a metaphor for the human struggle of freedom against slavery and light against darkness. And I think that's very much not the case. It's a foundation of our faith that the historical events that are recounted in the Torah are meant to be literal. Now, that does not deny them a symbolic meaning. If one studies Medrash and Hasidus and Kabbalah, one sees, for example, that every single historical event has enormous symbolic and eternal significance. So the literal does not negate the symbolic, but at the same time, the symbolic does not exclude the historicity of the Torah. So I've even seen, even in the Orthodox camp, very, very left-wing orthodoxy, that they've looked at the Avot, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, as mythical figures. I hate to be condemnatory, but I think that would be pretty much in the nature of heresy, to deny the physical existence of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and that we, the Jewish people, are descended from the Avos, although it's true that the Avos are also archetypes, for example, of Torah, Avodah, Gemilas, Chasadim, the three fundamental principles of the world. Torah, which is Yaakov, and Avodah, divine service, which is Yitzchak, and Gemilas Chesed, loving kindness, which is Avram. Having said that, however, I think a distinction can be drawn between what you might call the pre-history of the Jewish people. That is, the history of the Jewish people as an Am really begins with Avraham. Avraham is often called the first Jew, although that's a bit of a confusing name. But nevertheless, this was the first time that God made a covenant with a single person who was not representing all of humanity. God's covenant with Noach was for everybody. With Avraham, we already have the concept of choice. So as a result, I believe there is more latitude, certainly in the creation story, and perhaps even in the flood story. There is more latitude for a less literal interpretation than we would have once we enter the history of the Jewish people, which is Avraham Avinu. I think the Rishonim themselves recognized that the Torah was not giving you a scientific blow-by-blow account of how God created the world. And thus, now again, what I'm saying now is a little controversial, and I need to make very, very clear that I am not an official spokesman for any yeshiva or any movement, and there may be rabbis that will disagree with me, but no, this is the way of the Torah. But I follow an approach that was espoused by a very, very great Talmud Chacham in Bnei Brak, Rabbi Gedalia Nadel, Zichrono Livracha, and he cited a number of sources that indicates that the Torah is not automatically dealing with the scientific details of creation, and if the fundamental lesson of Bereshis is that God is the architect, once you accept that, then the particular details, even of age of the earth and dinosaurs and even evolution, and here again I'm being a little controversial, are not really that important as long as you understand these are not random and chaotic processes, but they are directed by specific divine intervention to accomplish God's needs and our needs. In other words, the how of creation is much less significant from a Jewish religious perspective than the fact that God is the architect and the controller of the creative processes. And thus, I do think that in Parshat Bereshis in particular, there is room much more for metaphorical interpretation than the other parts of the Torah. But I do want to emphasize, once we get into Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, the exodus of Egypt, the giving of the Torah, the exploits in the desert, etc., you really do have to accept them as historically accurate, although, as I said before, that does not negate deep and profound symbolic meaning side by side with its historicity.